Forged Battalion is a really weird little game. It's got an interesting premise. What if you designed your army from modular parts in a real-time strategy game? Wrap that up in simple classic gameplay that harkens back to a 90s era of games, and then coat that in an amazingly beautiful stylized aesthetic that evokes a sense of what our imaginations saw games as back when we only had 640 by 480 pixels to our screens. To start out with, I'm going to tell you if this is a spud or dud, and for me, this game is definitely a spud. If you're into classic RTS gameplay, bright and cheerful aesthetics, and the idea of building an army out of unlockable parts appeals to you, I can definitely say this will be a spud for you too. At the price point of €20 or your regional equivalent, which I will assume is $20, and a 15% launch week discount, I can safely say this game feels really well priced, if not underpriced. I would have happily played €25 for this game, but getting it at €17 was a steal in my opinion, and I'm super happy with the purchase. A fair word of warning though, the game is early access and a lot of you guys are not going to be super thrilled by that, so caveat emptor, let the buyer beware. I have encountered some bugs while playing and the game is fairly polished but feels occasionally unrefined in its design. So now I'll describe the game in the best detail that I can. I'm really struggling to know whether I should talk about the gameplay or the unit customization first. They're both linked in a way that you can't really separate them, but not linked as a topic when it comes to describing them. To err on the side of caution, I'll describe the high-level gameplay loop experience of Forged Battalion as it stands for a new player in the early access build. First, you play a standard RTS game. It could be a single-player campaign or skirmish, or it could be online multiplayer, ranked or unranked. After that, you'll be rewarded with some research points that you can use to unlock new things for your army. You go to the research screen and you unlock some new things, and then you go to the customization screen and you create some new units. And then you save your army and you go to play another game. About 20 seconds into that game, you realize you forgot to slot your units into your army, and so you quit that game and you go back to the customization screen and you make sure you slotted in all your new units. And then you can go play a game. And that's what a lot of your time is going to be spent doing while you're playing Forged Battalion, at least initially. On the RTS side of things, the gameplay is fairly solid on the fundamentals. Base building is essentially what it was back in Command & Conquer. Buildings project an area of influence that you can build in. You have production buildings which you can unsurprisingly use to produce units. You have refineries that act as drop-off locations for your harvesters, and they also come with a free harvester. You have expensive tech buildings that unlock higher power units. You have defensive structures that are quite cost efficient, but they can't move around the map. And all of that sounds fairly standard when it comes to classic RTS. But the real monkey wrench here is the faction designer system that touches every single piece of this puzzle. You see, you're not just making some generic infantry. Outside of the first game or two, you're going to be producing handcrafted units whose weapons have different power levels, different mechanics, different ranges, different fire rates, and different damage multipliers. There's a lot to take in when it comes to building a unit. You have to ask yourself questions like, what phase of the game do I want to use this unit in? More powerful attributes can put your unit behind a tech wall, and you need to have a balanced army of early and late game units. Another question could be, what am I going to be fighting with this unit? For example, let's say you want to design an early game infantry unit. In Tech Phase 1, you're only going to be going up against infantry and light vehicles, so you don't want to pick the anti-material gun because that has negative damage multipliers against those kinds of units. The machine gun is pretty low tech, which will allow you to bring armor, but it's only good against other infantry. Similarly, the RPG is low tech and good against light vehicles, and it has a better transition into Phase 2, but it is quite a bit more expensive. So maybe you think you'll bring one of each, but you have a limited number of slots in your faction. You can only bring 4 infantry with you, and each infantry you bring in your deck increases the cost of your barracks. So maybe you only take 1 infantry unit with a laser rifle, which is a pretty general purpose weapon. It's a pretty high tech level though, which means you're going to need to give up your armor, but that might be worth it so you don't have to use up 2 slots of infantry to counter early game units. You might even just forego early game infantry entirely and just use light vehicles to bridge the gap to Phase 2. I hope that adequately describes the layers of decision making you have to go through when you're designing a deck. And that was just 2 major questions we asked to get to that level of complexity. We didn't even ask, what's my strategy? Are you going to be rushing your opponent? Are you going to be building up a death ball and then pushing your opponent? Are you going to be doing hit and runs and map control? These sorts of questions add even more layers to the complexity of designing your units. Now, as cool as the whole customization system is, there are cases where your choices are trivial, which I'm going to assume is mostly down to the nature of early access. But the main one that really stuck out to me was I never really saw a reason to put treads or walker legs on my ground vehicles. It just seemed to make them slower, more expensive, and a higher tech level. I'm pretty sure this sort of stuff will be addressed, so I wouldn't put too much weight on it, but I did think it was worth mentioning. There's also a problem of going in blind, and so you're kind of naturally pushed towards building a general purpose deck that can deal with a variety of threats rather than building a themed or specialized deck that has a particular strategy in mind. I'm not saying that's necessarily a bad thing. It's just an observation, and there's plenty of room with the 16 units you get, 4 of each type, plus 3 turrets, a super weapon, and a HQ specialty that will allow you to build a strategy around all those different options. But you're definitely going to want general purpose tools in your faction no matter what, which can sometimes make the decks feel a little bit homogenized. The game uses a tech tree progression system to unlock components for your army. This is definitely something I'm not a huge fan of in general for RTS games. Metagame progression systems have big problems when it comes to real-time strategy. I've actually talked about this before in my 40-minute rant video on why I didn't like Age of Empires 3, but basically the complaint is that new players already have a skill disadvantage over more experienced players, and adding a progression system simply serves to widen that gap without offering an opportunity for that player to learn from that game. I also really don't like progression systems in general because I feel like it's just a psychological treadmill for me to run along. I'm very much the kind of person who likes to get a big bag of toys to play around with and see what happens. Putting a progression system in my way just feels like I have to do work to actually do what I want, which is kind of defeating the purpose of me playing a game, so I'm more likely to lose interest and give up on playing your game if it has a progression system. Now that said, it's not the worst progression system I've ever come across. The game is very generous with its rewards for wins and losses, and you can pick up extra meta progression points in missions by blowing up buildings and picking up research crates. Very few of the unlocks are boring, and almost every time you go to the unlock screen you'll have a fun new toy that you'll want to experiment with. Some of the unlocks are a little bit disappointing and underwhelming. I have briefly chatted with the developers and they said the progression system is something they're hearing a lot of feedback about and will be working on. So now that we've talked about the army designer, we need to talk about the gameplay again. There are 4 types of units. Each weapon has different multipliers against different types of units. Rocket weapons tend to do well against vehicles. Machine guns do well against infantry, but pretty terribly against everything else. There are artillery weapons that have a huge range, but if your vehicles are really fast, you can dodge the shells. Goo grenades do no damage, but they slow people down and make them take more damage from flamethrower weapons. Flamethrowers have a short range, but they can hit multiple units. There's even weapons that you can use to heal your units with. There's a lot of choice when it comes to designing your army, and it means that every time you play multiplayer, it's likely you're going to encounter a different combination of units and abilities and strategies. But not only that, you're going to be using a different combination of units, abilities, and strategies yourself. So every game will at least feel different until a metagame develops. Unfortunately, the gameplay is let down a little bit by there being no limit on how many units you can build or control at once, which leads us to a big blobbing problem. Most games are decided almost entirely by who is able to get the most money and mass up the bigger blob, and if it's not by that, then it's who had better or the right equipment to counter the other player. There have been a couple of games where micromanagement saved the day for me, and a couple of games where careful map control and hit and runs won me the game, but most of the combat is blob versus blob. This is again something developers have said they got a lot of feedback about and are looking to address, so I won't judge the game too harshly in this early access period. This is obviously a game built on a budget, but that doesn't mean it's not a labor of love. It's extraordinarily well put together. The art style, as I mentioned at the beginning, evokes a modern take on what my imagination saw games as when I was a kid. Clear, bright graphics with a lot of things happening on the screen and special effects galore. As if to pound on that nostalgia even harder, Frank Klepacki did the music for the game, and for those of you who remember the amazing soundtracks of Command & Conquer, are in for a real treat. I still listen to Mechanical Man a few times a year, and I first heard that song 22 years ago. I've definitely enjoyed my time with the game and I will be playing it some more. I'm looking forward to covering the game on launch, and I'm also looking forward to updates, and I'm really excited to see what other expansion packs they might have planned for the game. I hope the information contained in this early access first impression / review has helped you make a purchasing decision. That's it for me, Potato McWhiskey. I love you all very much and I'll see you next time. Bye bye.